Welcome to Festival for Change. Hello everyone, my name is Kaisa and I'm honored to have here today Bruce Davies, who is a co-founder and joint managing director of Abundance Investments, the leading regulated ethical crowdfunding platform in the UK, which has raised more than £101 million for green and socially positive projects and businesses. Abundance helped develop Community Municipal Investments in partnerships with the University of Leeds and are working with councils across the UK to develop Climate Municipal Investments with West Berkshire, Warrington and Islington councils. Bruce Davies is also visiting research fellow at the Bauman Institute and has just published a new book, Crowdfunding and the Democratization of Finance, through Bristol University Press, co-authored with Dr. Mark Davies. Thank you so much for being here today, Bruce. We are excited to hear from you.
Thanks very much. I'll give a quick intro and a bit more background on Abundance and what we're trying to do with the councils, and hopefully that will prompt some questions. Abundance is, for a long time, we've tried to find different ways to allow individuals to make investments into green and socially positive projects. And as the climate emergency has moved up the agenda, we focused that very much then onto the climate emergency. And we started out funding wind turbines, solar parks. And in 2016, we worked with a local council, Swindon Council, to fund 2 large solar parks with them. And in that process, we realized there was some more ways that actually people could get involved. So we then spent the next 2-3 years working with Leeds and others to develop a new type of investment that's actually something which councils have done for a very long time. So they have, excuse me, called a municipal investment. So back in Victorian times, councils issued investments to build infrastructure like water systems, electricity systems, and those sorts of things in the new cities that were being built. And those were funded by local people lending money to the council. And so we brought that product back, but in a new way, using the internet so people can do it online, because that was the main reason those things had died out, was that they were done on paper and they had to keep a paper certificate for all their investors, and it cost quite a lot of money and lots of people to run those things. So we made it simpler, and now what we have is a way for people to invest directly in their local council, and to finance the projects the local councils identified to support their action on the climate emergency. I think using the structure we have, the council very simply issues the investment. They decide what the money is going to be spent on, and they raise the money from local citizens. And as a citizen, you lend the money through either a bond or a loan. And depending on how it's put together, that can qualify you for to put that investment into a tax-free product, which is the Innovative Finance ISA. So it's quite a simple product. It's relatively low risk, so it has a relatively low return, usually pays between 1 and 1.5% interest. And that's because, unlike other investments that you might do through Abundance and other platforms where you're investing into a particular project, here you're putting your money in the care of the local council, and they're spending it. But local councils have certain rules about how they have to pay back any borrowing that they make. So we just lend to the council on the same terms actually that the UK government does. So that's the main way at the moment that local councils raise money for local initiatives. They borrow money from UK government. All we're doing is replacing UK government with local people. And the minimum investment is £5. That's deliberate to make anyone feel that they can play a role. Because what we see is, in climate, it's one of those big issues we're asked to address as individuals. The assumption, though, is often that we can only really make a difference through what we do through our consumption. And I guess we believe that a much bigger focus is needed on the power of your money to make change happen, not in terms of what you spend, but how you invest it. And I guess we've kind of got out of the habit of making investments. Investing isn't something that everybody does. It's not seen as an everyday kind of thing. So we're trying to bring that back, which is much more the culture of investing and lending that we used to have maybe 100 years ago. So as ever with finance, we have quite short memories, but there's always a product that we used to do. So even with crowdfunding, that is just the way that people used to raise money over the centuries. But this new way, this municipal investment, that's really just building on the existing structures that councils had and just finding a new way of delivering it through using technology. So the first, as you said, we did 2 investments with West Berkshire and with Warrington. Those were pilot bonds, so they were testing out whether or not people were up for doing this. So we did £1 million for each of those, and they were very successful. West Berkshire was funding solar installations on rooftops and also biodiversity projects. Warrington's was funding a big solar project that they had, or part funding it. And now we're working with Islington, who are looking at a number of things, including things like electric vehicles, local recycling initiatives, and those sorts of things. So you can fund a range of stuff because basically the contract, if you like, the investment is backed by the council's sort of stated aim in terms of the strategy and their capital spending that they're going to do. So how they're going to spend money that they borrow to invest. And as a council, they're democratically accountable. So everything is transparent and you can see where your money is going. So we work on that basis. And as I said, so far, yes, we've had 2 bonds that have been successful, and Islington has raised nearly 600,000 of its 1 million target. And we're hoping for 2 more councils who've announced to raise bonds or loans in the new year, up in the Midlands and another one in London. So it's beginning to gain momentum as a new product area. And it's been slightly helped because separately Abundance and others have campaigned quite hard that the UK government themselves should issue a green bond, because we think it would focus government on delivering initiatives on the ground in terms of the climate emergency, and that was announced. And part of that bond raise is being done through National Savings and Investments. So that will sit alongside things like the Community Municipal Investments and others, the local climate bonds that we've done. So people start to get a range of options that are a little bit lower risk, but they still have, you can still see that your money is having an impact.
That is really nice to hear, and glad to hear that also it's kind of spreading. I was wondering, just to take a small step back, because this is kind of this crowdfunding or this transparent ways is a bit different from the way we currently still do or invest in this like private finance institutes. So I was wondering, why is this private finance dangerous? Like, why should we like make this step towards these green bonds?
Well, I think there's been lots of different ways that councils have tried to raise money to invest, and for a long time there were approaches that tried to bring in what's called institutional money, so money that's in pension funds or banks and so on. And the attractiveness of that is there's quite large amounts of it. The problem is that to get those projects off the ground, you need quite complex contracts and agreements. And I think what we're trying to do is simplify the model and say, really what you should be focusing on here is, more democratization of the process of financing local projects. And democratization, and this is something that Mark and I explored in the book, is not a simple kind of voting or having a say in that respect. It's also about the deliberation and consultation with people. So one of the main barriers to people taking action on the climate emergency in the past has been that sometimes initiatives feel like they've been imposed on people. I think we've seen this in the UK in particular, where we're experimenting a little bit, sort of spurred on by the pandemic and what was needed there, but we're experimenting with sort of low traffic networks, things like that. And you can see on the ground that they are very polarizing in terms of the way people respond to them. And it comes down to different people having different views on whether their freedoms have been constrained too much. But I think underneath that is perhaps a sense of powerlessness in the decision-making process. So what we try and do with the investments is to give people literal buy-in to the process of decision-making around environment strategy or local energy strategy for the local council, and to open up a new channel of communication. It's been quite surprising, I must admit. I head up the communication side for Abundance, and local councils have relatively few mechanisms to communicate to their residents beyond sending out the council tax bill once a year. They're not really set up to engage people on a regular basis, except through maybe very basic email newsletters, that kind of thing. So what we hope with the investments is you'll have 1,000 people for each investment who are basically for the next 5 years are going to be getting a regular cash return from you, and that is an opportunity to communicate to those residents about what you're doing. So I think some of this is a breakdown in communication, and I think if the response to the pandemic has taught us anything, it's taught us of the value of having ways to engage us as citizens, and not simply once every 4 or 5 years ask for our vote, or similarly once a year ask for our money for a tax bill. Instead what we're saying is, okay, twice a year you're going to be giving money back to people in return for which they for their investment that they made. And one of the options we gave people was to be able to donate back some or all of their interest payment from the bond to the council for additional projects, and we found that about 10% of people on average are willing to do that, which might be quite a small amount of money, but it adds up over time, and that's something the councils have actually been quite excited about.
Yeah, no, super interesting to hear, and especially about the barriers of like this maybe lack of good way to communicate with the people. Looking into the chat, I see some questions. Nicolette asks, how can citizen investors wanting green and social returns see the transformation impact of their investments when there are multiple benefits, and how, when, where they will manifest is uncertain?
Okay, I think that's a good question. So we're trying to study this. So there is a theory that we should be generating social co-benefits from these initiatives, clean air, all of these things. Quantifying that's quite hard, and we may not be able to quantify it. We may have to make a qualitative judgment about it. But I think over, say, 5 years, we're hoping that the council will be able to show, whether that's through local health data, these sorts of things, that there are having positive impacts in terms of the initiatives that they're taking. And we're encouraging councils to sort of be more open about that broader impact. So yeah, when you get your cash return, you get a full update from the council about what's been done. So if I take West Berkshire as an example, because they've got a very good comms team, we invested half of the bond into biodiversity and roadside verges. So we've been able to show the investors through the year the verges growing and the benefits that has brought in terms of biodiversity, and we'll be able to go back and measure whether we've had a positive increase in that regard. So I think it's some of that will be quite intangible, but we're hoping one of the drivers for wanting to do this, and this is one of the drivers for councils, is that they do see those broader benefits of engagement, as well as, fundamentally we aren't raising the borrowing cost for councils. So if they're borrowing from our investors, they're borrowing actually cheaper than they would from UK government. So we're saving them money. That was important. We had to achieve that. But on the other side, the councils are now beginning to build up evidence to show that it has these other benefits, and that's I think what we will kind of review and audit over the next sort of 2 or 3 years. And we've got there's some students who are looking at that, PhD students, but also working with the councils themselves.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, Nicolette. Henry asks, do you know much about who invests? What is the range of quantity of investments? Are there a lot of small investors? Are they mainly from local community or from across the UK?
Okay, so in terms of who invests, in a broad sense, they are everybody. So we see from 18 years old up to 90. But they tend to be people who are what we consider to be altruistic. And by that we mean people who are kind of, they may volunteer to do something in their community, or they've done some sort of charitable activity in the last sort of 12 months. That seems to be the correlation, right? That sort of mix. In terms of the range and quantity of investments, what we see is it's similar to our crowdfund. So the average investment is around £1,000. Local investors, interestingly, into Islington, they've invested nearly £3,000. So they're kind of, what we've seen is that people outside Islington investing about the same amount that they would normally, but actually Islington residents have invested much more than we would expect. And the most we've ever seen from the individual is over 100,000 into one of these. So it really, you can't predict very much how much money an individual is going to put in, because you don't know what money they have or what their financial goals are. But in general, we've seen between 10 to 20% of investors, depending on the area, being local. And we expect that number to rise because the local investors are very much come in as a function of whatever we can put together in terms of local communications and local press coverage, local media. So if people see it and they're aware of it, we generally see them coming in. But it's quite hard to get people to kind of view something. And the Warrington bond, for example, that was right in the middle of one of the big lockdowns. So it's been quite challenging to sort of get the word out there. But over time, we hope, and this is something we hope, as councils do more of these investments, we'll see more local residents participating. But what's interesting is often people have a connection to a borough even if they don't live there, because they may have been born there or they may have a family who are there. So there can be lots of reasons for people to invest.
Yeah, no, that's super nice to hear. Another question from Nicolette. How accessible are the green bonds to less will of citizens who don't have surplus capital to tie up for a fixed period of time?
Well, the minimum investment being £5 means that you get the same level of information and feedback if you had 5,000. And we've always been very clear that the minimum investment should be low to allow people to feel that they're participating and they are investors in their council, even if they don't have as much money to invest. And the choosing this sort of lower risk option, because with Swindon we were investing into the project, and so that paid a higher return. It paid sort of 6 or 7%, but you were taking a risk, and the risk was that the solar park didn't produce the energy that it was expected, or there was some problem in the construction. So that wouldn't be suitable for everybody, and we have protections and tests that we do for investors when they're coming onto our platform to make sure they've understood the risks of what they're doing. But in terms of local councils, as I said, the risk there is much lower, and so we're hoping that's a more accessible product for people to consider, and possibly sort of like their first ever green investment, because I think a lot of people don't have much confidence when it comes to investing, and we're hoping that making it the local council as the person that you're investing with will bring more people into the idea that they can make an investment, because actually that's quite important. We have a sort of culture, this is a UK one, I think it's also in the Netherlands actually, having worked there a bit, where we sort of put savings in a bank on a pedestal. We sort of think that's the best thing to do is have savings, have it in cash. And we like to think of that cash just sitting there doing nothing and maybe accruing a bit of interest, but it's not doing any harm. What happens though when you put savings in a bank is the bank uses that as part of the capital that it used to create loans. So it will have an effect. It is having an effect. There's no such thing, and therefore, as a sort of passive investment or saving. you can't be passive on climate change. So I suppose we're trying to jolt people a little bit to sort of reconsider whether, simply seeing savings as the kind of gold standard of safety is really what we mean by safety anymore. That actually you're having an impact with those savings, whether you like it or not. That said, there's obviously you need money, you need to be able to access it, and you're right. You have to, the money is invested for 5 years. You get it returned over that period. But the only way you can get your money out directly before that is to sell the investment, which we offer that service, but it's not guaranteed that it will happen in the time frame that you might need.
Yeah, no, super exciting to hear about that. And thank you for the question, Nicolette. Henry wonders if the communication with investors is going to be two-way.
So yes, in the sense that we survey, there's options to have surveys with our investors, and investors can give feedback on the things that are coming in terms of the updates. I haven't seen evidence of that yet sort of on the ground. At the moment, I think the council that is furthest forward with this, West Berkshire, they're developing platforms to sort of encourage more engagement. So what we're hoping is that becomes the model that other councils adopt. But they're very much the pioneers on this. And from what I've seen so far, they have come up with some really nice materials that they've shared with investors about what their investment is doing and the broader environment strategy. So hopefully, yes, they've got more engaged people and I suppose a slightly broader group than would otherwise normally get involved in, say, consultations on things like local transport or environment type issues.
Yeah, no, really, really interesting. Thanks, Henry. Nicolette asks, whilst councils defaulting on the interest of the community bonds is a low risk, sometimes the opposite is true of their ability to deliver major infrastructure projects. How can citizens mitigate? I think it's.
Yeah. Okay. I think it's a good challenge, because I think from what I've seen, we're not dealing with big necessarily big infrastructure projects. What we're looking at here is electric vehicle charging networks. We're looking at interventions at small scale interventions, but being delivered through the council. They can be held to account for that as to whether or not it gets delivered, and I guess we're putting more focus and transparency onto those projects to make sure they actually do get done. And within the, if you like, the deed that so each investment has a deed that sort of sets out the use of money, and so we are being quite clear what that money has to be used for. The council has a very sort of small option that they might change their mind, because you can't 100% say it has to be used for that, but 99%. And but I think we're not at this stage kind of saying, okay, well, this is a complete new power station or something like that, and we're not expecting councils necessarily to deliver those. What we're saying is actually this is changing the way we use cars, changing the way we use transport, changing the sort of daily life interventions which councils are sort of manage and have to deal with on a daily basis. So I think it is a challenge. The thing we feel is that if you previously, for these big projects, there was a lot of distrust around them because there wasn't much transparency, and it was often put under the sort of banner of commercial confidentiality. With a public investment, you don't have that. So it's very much you can see into them, and I think that councils understand that, and actually I think they prefer to operate in that way if they can. So it will all be how people can kind of hold them to account democratically for delivering on the things that your own money, which I guess gives you a little bit of leverage, is backing to make happen. But I think from what I've seen, on the default side, it's illegal for a council to default on its borrowing. But the reason for that is that they would have to cut services. So I think what we've seen from our investors is it will be interesting if there was a situation like that in a way, because how much investors would say, okay, we'll withhold, we won't take interest payments to support the council because they've got a direct kind of interest in the council providing those services for a short period. But hopefully we're never in that situation. But these councils are under a lot of pressure, and they're having to do it. For the last 10 years, they've had to do an awful lot with a reducing budget. My experience is the ones who are kind of pioneering on the investments are actually, despite what might be the way they're portrayed in the media, they're actually very efficient and they get on with things. So we're hoping that this kind of shines a light on the fact that councils were in the front line on COVID and they actually did quite a good job. And now they're on the front line of climate change.
Yeah, no, really inspiring also to hear about that. Thank you, Nicolette. Henry asks, what other local authorities have shown interest and may get involved in the future?
So we've been working with the Green Finance Institute to sort of do a little campaign to get local authorities to pledge that they're going to do a bond, particularly because of COP26 kind of focused minds somewhat. And so what we've seen so far is we've got councils from in Wales as Blaenau Gwent, which is an interesting one because it's pretty much ground zero of the coal industry. But they want to build a wind turbine, so that's quite cool. And we've seen Telford, as I said, there's a couple of councils in London, and also across the south coast there seems to be a few. So we're talking to I think 25% of UK councils in some way, shape, or form, and of those 6 or 7 have now pledged. So there's 400 councils in the UK. So I suppose we're talking to about 100 of them in various forms, and some it will be 2 or 3 years before they get to making an investment. Others are moving quite quickly. It's been interesting with Islington launching. That's made several London councils want to move forward more quickly because they're quite competitive. So as more do it, I can see it kind of snowballing a little bit.
Yeah, no, but that's super nice to hear that others are starting to adopt that as well, and even maybe there's this slight competitive
yeah, it's interesting because they're quite conservative. They don't want to be first, because obviously there's a risk in doing that if you get it wrong. But once it's been done, they're then quite competitive to be second.
Yeah. Also, time-wise, let's have our last question for this session. Nicolette asks, innovation in council citizen communication needs to go hand in hand with the financial innovation. Can democratic accountability be aligned with the different accountability investors require?
I think this is a little bit what I said before around this expanding the idea of sort of democracy a little bit. So we've kind of allowed our democratic processes have become a little bit siloed. We think of it as something we do when we vote, or maybe getting involved in a consultation, but that tends to be when it's very much directly affecting our own place, where we live. And at other times we don't sort of volunteer to sort of provide that. I think things like the citizen assemblies that have been sort of popping up in different places really show that actually if you bring in a diverse group of people, and this is, I think, the important bit, that it is as diverse as you can make it from the community, you create a conversation that is very different to sort of what I perceive as the quite polarized views that you get perhaps through local media, or if you like, the sort of usual suspects that respond to consultations and so on. You tend to get more extreme views in those. We've worked a lot on those sort of consultations in the past. As Abundance, we were supporting wind farms and other types of projects where people were, effectively quite scared of them. They didn't really understand what they were. Now we're sort of kind of got used to the idea of a wind turbine, but it was a terrifying prospect for some people, it seemed. And there was a lot of misinformation out there. So I think what we're trying to do with this is say, okay, for the local councils, don't just think of it as your citizens as being, you either deal with them as customers, i.e. they buy your services effectively through their council tax, or voters, which is where the councillors, the members, are focused, but actually somewhere in between. So where they are supporting quite directly something that you're doing within the community. And as such, they become another constituency, they become another group, and potentially, we hope, a more diverse group for them to engage with. So they aren't just forming opinions about what people think on the street from what I think is, we've discovered this, in the Red Wall constituencies, the Red Wall councils, feelings are quite heated and conflicted between different politics, and it rather makes the debate quite toxic about what should be done. And we're trying to sidestep that and say it's not about politics, really. It's about climate change and what are we going to do as a community, and we have to pull together, rather than who is right or wrong on, basically red, blue, yellow, whatever the color of their politics are. We would rather not get into the ideological debates about this, but actually just get into the practical, what needs to be done. And as a community, can we decide collectively what are the best ways forward, aside from the politics of it?
Thank you so much for being here today, Bruce. It was
Okay.
really thought-provoking half an hour. And the